All right. This is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 27, Section 4, Nationalism and the Rise of Italy, Germany, and Japan. So, by far, one of the most powerful ideas or ideologies in the post-French Revolutionary era, even after that, is nationalism. We can think of nationalism as pride in one's nation. And a nation is simply just a group of people who share the same, and it could be a couple of things. The greatest kind of indicator of nationalism or nation, a group of people, is language. Not always. So it might also be something like religion. We might just call these things, we could say culture in general, beliefs. In some ways, it could even be experiences. Let's see, experiences, right? So a nation is simply just a group of people who have a lot of things in common. And once you have enough of those things in common, you can kind of talk about this as being a nation of individuals. Again, language being kind of the greatest indicator of that. So in thinking about nationalism, language and national identity in Europe before 1871, like we said, language, we're going to say this again, language is the most important indicator of nationalism. Not always. So for example, religion is sometimes also used. The example that your textbook states is German Protestants versus German Catholics. You know, there are a lot more Catholics, for example, in Austria, whereas when you got further north, there were a lot more Protestants. So even though these two groups of people, Austrians and Germans, could potentially be, are similar in the language that they speak, they might not think of themselves as belonging to the same sort of national group because of differences in something like religion. Now, nationalism was also something that was advocated primarily by those who were considered liberals. Now, when we think about 19th century politics, liberalism and conservatism are kind of the two camps. And when we mean liberalism, we're not, we got to think about it in the sense of the 19th century, and what we should immediately think of is the French Revolution. So liberals were those that were in favor of the changes brought about by the French Revolution. So this would be things like democracy, might be something like free speech, right? Freedom of religion, a lot of the things associated with the Enlightenment movement, right? What those people were advocating for. The conservatives, these are more like pro-king, pro-church, for example. You could say anti-democracy. These are the constituents that would say the changes by the French Revolution were too radical and we should establish kind of like this old order. And there was, kind of this uptick in liberalism during the revolutions of 1848. These were revolutions that broke out all across Europe, advocating for more liberal reforms to open up the political process to more democracy, voting rights, freedom of speech, etc., etc. Now, for the most part, these things failed. However, one consequence of this was that rather than liberalism being like the only group for nationalist sentiment, is that conservatives began to really look at nationalism as a tool to embrace and use. So, before 1848, nationalism was specifically something associated with liberalism, right? Pride in one's nation. But after 1848, more states, leaders, more conservatives looked towards nationalism as something that could potentially be used. Italy is a great example of this sort of balance between liberalism and conservatism and the way that it sort of interacts with this idea of pride in one's nation. So when it came to Italy and the unification of the modern Italian state, those who were opposed were, of course, those associated with the old order, right? Pope Pius IX. Of course, this was very strong backing from the Catholic Church, who didn't want to see their power be diminished. Austria, which again was another state that was really conservative in a sense, right? Pro, like emperor, for example, very little or even no voting. I don't even know Austria in the 19th century if there was even any voting that took place there. It was still very much an old monarchical nobility, very close ties with the church type of system. But there was a lot of support from liberal and conservatives, though. So, for example, the state Piedmont, Sardinia, so this is a northern Italian state. The prime minister, Camillo Benso de Cavour, so he is the Piedmont, Sardinia prime minister, wanted a modern Italian state. And again, what we mean by this, what do we mean by the modern Italian state? Well, let's go back up to the greatest or most important indicator of nationalism. Again, that is language. So essentially Cavour, what he would want is that he would want all Italians, or we'll say all Italian speakers, to create one state, which would become Italy, right? That's the idea. So to unite everybody who speaks the same language, who shares enough of these common features, right? If you share all these features, well, to create what then is called a nation state. And that is, on the one hand, a nation, people with the same characteristics, and a state would be a specific government. Now, of course, in this particular period in Italy, and really in a lot of other areas, people who shared similar national characteristics were divided into various different political entities, right? So here is, the kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia. Sardinia is down here. Piedmont is up here. The Papal States were in one area. The Kingdom of Two Sicilies were down here, not to mention all the Italians living in France, the Italians living in Austria, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea was to take everyone who shared the same nationality and to create a state around them. And Camillo Benso de Cavour, who was a count, so he was of the nobility, with the help of King Victor Emmanuel, created a state in northern Italy that began this process of Italian unification and creating a modern state of Italy. So this was to embrace nationalism. So to show that nationalism doesn't necessarily have to be in opposition to a king, it could be in support of the king. Meanwhile, Giuseppe Garibaldi, in the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, led a revolution. And again, this would have been much more in line with the characteristics of liberalism and in the spirit of the French Revolution, right? To lead a revolution from below. After overthrowing the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, Cavour was able to kind of pick up the pieces, you might say, and create the modern state of the Kingdom of Italy, which was created as a constitutional monarchy, right? So this is the birth of the modern state of Italy. And again, the idea is to take a lot of these different political provinces, right, which have a similar characteristic in terms of nationality, and bring them all together into one state. The story of German nationalism and German unification is perhaps more consequential simply for the fact that Germany, by the 1890s, is one of the most powerful nations industrially in the world, militarily, economically, and it really upsets the sort of balance of power. German unification was initiated by Prussia. This was a northern German state, and Prussia had the benefit of industrial technology. It was the most industrial in Germany, and by industrial I mean the most railroads, the most factories, the most advanced technology. The person really most responsible for unification of Germany is Otto von Bismarck. He was the prime, I want to say the prime minister of Prussia, I want to say, right? And, much like the story of Italian unification was kind of a dual effort, right? It was Cavour and it was Garibaldi. Really, the sole person responsible for German unification, we could say, is more or less Bismarck. Bismarck wanted to unite the various different German-speaking lands. So if we go back to this map here, again, we're talking about an area in Germany that has similar languages, similar culture, but divided up into all these different states. You can kind of see the mismatch and hodgepodge of different kingdoms that existed. And, Bismarck wanted to do this really through warfare. And one of the ways he did it was first by going to war against Austria. After that, those that were allied with Otto von Bismarck in Austria created the North German Confederation. So we might call this Prussia and their North German allies. And again, warfare was used much like up here. Cavour also used warfare, a war against France, I believe, or a war against Austria. But warfare is used as a way of bringing nations together in kind of the same way that the French people fought their adversaries on behalf of France. A lot of these conflicts are being fought on behalf of nations, Germany, Italy, etc., etc. In 1871, Bismarck went to war with France, the Franco-Prussian War, which was a German victory and really prompted German unification. All right, so 1871 was when the modern state of Germany was created. And in doing so, occupied the territories of Alsace and Lorraine. These were French, now German territories. Alsace and Lorraine, if we go to our map here, we can see that these are the two territories down here, right? So those had previously belonged to France, now were German. And it was a little bit, Alsace and Lorraine are kind of a good example of how nationalism is not always, clear cut, because in this case, most people who lived there thought of themselves as French, but in fact were mostly German speakers. So, Germany claimed that they were in fact German when most people actually believed themselves to be France. And with going to war with Austria, with going to war against Prussia, Otto von Bismarck, and sort of the slogan for German unification was blood and iron. Blood means unification through war. Iron meaning industry, really Prussia that led the way in terms of using railroads and other industrial technologies. And by 1871, again, before in the 1850s, this area right here in Central Europe was simply just a hodgepodge of different German states under various different rulers. By 1871, the modern state of Germany pretty much encapsulates all of this area here. And again, by the 1890s, this is a country that is, pretty much 20 years old, but has the industrial, economic, and military capacity to challenge, pretty much everyone on the planet, including the British and including the United States. So it creates a very disruptive sort of political arena there. Another important industrial power in the late 1800s is Japan. Now, where we last left off in Japan was with the Tokugawa Shogunate. The shogun is the supreme military ruler. Remember that in the year 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu went to war with all the local daimyos. Daimyos are landowners. Defeated all of them, united Japan under one government, and in an effort to try and retain control, issued a number of seclusion decrees, which pretty much banned trade with outsiders, with the exception of the port of Nagasaki. It made things like firearms illegal. It pretty much isolated Japan from the outside world, even made it a death penalty for anybody from Japan to leave the country. And this was all done in an effort to try and maintain power. However, a lot of things had happened, between 1860 and between the 1600s and the 1850s, namely the Industrial Revolution. And so when the American Commodore Matthew Perry arrives in Tokyo Bay with a modern navy, it becomes very clear, at least to the Japanese elites, to a certain number of daimyo, that Japan has certainly fallen behind in terms of technology and something needs to be done. Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States forces Japan to sign the Treaty of Kanagawa. Again, the Japanese are unable to resist the modern navy of the United States, and the Treaty of Kanagawa is much like the unequal treaties that existed in China. It gives the United States a privileged position to really take advantage of Japan economically. This is not acceptable for a group of sort of reform-minded elites that really resent the shogun for not being able to protect them. And so a revolution of sorts happens in Japan. It's referred to the Meiji Restoration, but it is in some cases a revolution, right? And that is when a couple of these elite daimyos, other important people in Japan, overthrow the shogun and establish a new government. Not really good handwriting there, but anyways. They restore the reason for the restoration is they take previously what was considered a cultural figurehead, the emperor, and place him now in charge of a new government. So 1868 marks the beginning of a new regime in Japan. And the Meiji Restoration is all about embracing foreign ideas. It's about modernization, that is to adopt industrial technology. And Japan does a great job of really catching up to the rest of the world. So some examples of what the Japanese copy, you might say, from the outside world. The army is reformed to a conscripted army, an education system much like the West. It means to send students to the US, Britain, and Germany. And at the same time to, you might say, import experts. The Japanese bring in German army officers to tell them how to reorganize their army, Germany being the most powerful army in the world at the time. They bring in British naval advisors to figure out how to create the best navy in the world. They bring in American, British, and German engineers. And so there's very close Western ties. However, what the Japanese do in the aftermath of this is that they expel what we might call the foreigners, and instead embrace what I'm going to call state capitalism, and that is government-sponsored industry. Right? So this is very much motivated by the state. Right? So to expel foreigners and to keep only Japanese experts. In other words, all these outsiders from the US, Germany, and Britain are brought in. They teach the Japanese people how to build their own railroads, how to build their own navy, how to run an industrial system. And once the Japanese gain all the knowledge, it's time to kick pretty much everybody out. And this is a way that both the state and businesses work together. Many of these mega powerful businesses were referred to as zaibatsu. So we might call zaibatsu, these are powerful corporate families that, of course, with the blessing of the government, get to create certain industries. So they get put in charge of, steel industries and mineral industries. One of these zaibatsus was the modern corporation of Toyota today, which of course makes Japanese cars. Back then they made, I think, like looms or something like that, factory looms or whatever it was. These businesses didn't have to compete with any other foreign businesses, and they really didn't have to compete with any other domestic businesses, because everything that was related to the economy and industry was not done for the individual profit of the zaibatsu, but all came back to Japan, right? The most important thing for this process here was to catch up to the West. By the 1870s, the Japanese had the first Japanese constructed railroads there. Some of the earliest ones in the US and the British were in the 1820s or even before that. So they were 50 years behind and needed to catch up. And with going on this very aggressive campaign towards modernization and embracing foreign ideas, Japan transformed itself from a country that was not very technologically advanced to one of the imperial powers. By 1910, not only do you see in this image here the various railroad networks that connect the nation together, but the Japanese were successful in creating their own imperial empire, taking over this island here, took over Korea in 1910. Taiwan was taken over in 1895. And so the Japanese are, on their own path of joining nations like the United States and nations in Western and Northern Europe to create their own imperial empires. Now, in the case of Germany, Italy, Japan, right? When we look at nationalism, nationalism was a uniting force. It brought people together, right? It brought German-speaking people together in one country, Germany. It brought the Italian-speaking people together in one country. Same with Japan, right? However, in other places like Russia, Austria, the Ottoman Empire, nationalism was a dividing factor. These were nations that had a lot of different nationalistic groups. The Russian Empire controlled a lot more people than just those who spoke Russian. There were Ukrainians and Lithuanians. There were Polish people. The Ottoman Empire, the same thing. The Austrian Empire, the same thing. So for them, the question was how to deal with different minority groups and to try and forge a nationalism. So for example, in Russia, there were efforts to Russify, and that is to force the Russian language on people in an effort to try and build a national identity around that. It was done in Spain with Spanish, right? There's different parts of Spain, Catalonia, for example. The Spanish language was forced to a certain extent. It was encouraged in the United States, where English was taught in public schools. But it's very important to take note of the different ways that nationalism affects different nations, right? For some, it's a dividing force. For others, it's a uniting force. Social Darwinism, another kind of important ideology that creeps up at this time period. Social Darwinism is based off of the works of Charles Darwin. He was a biologist. Mostly, his most important contribution is the idea of evolution. He studied birds and other animal life, and from his observations said that pretty much all species are connected and evolved over millions of years. His work on the origins of species in 1851, incredibly influential in changing the way that people thought about the world. And one of the ways in which Darwin's ideas impacted society was to take his ideas and apply them to things that weren't biology. So social Darwinism was Darwin's ideas applied, we might say incorrectly. Darwin was talking about birds to society, and we might even say nations and race. One of Darwin's kind of key phrases, you might say, was this idea of survival of the fittest. And he was trying to explain why certain species are more likely to pass on certain genes and characteristics. I actually don't think that he used the term genes, but certain characteristics. And, in this kind of no holds bars, dog eat dog natural environment, it's only the fittest of the species who mate and pass down their characteristics to the next generation. Well, this term survival of the fittest was applied by some social critics to these ideas here, right? Society, nations, and race, and more or less said that the more powerful nations, the more powerful races of the world, the more technologically advanced, were simply just biologically superior. And these ideas were used to justify what we might call, well, not what we might call, but used to justify imperialism and social inequalities. That is the differences between rich and poor. That is to say, well, what right does Great Britain have in ruling over India? Well, an advocate for social Darwinism would simply just say, well, the British are, biologically superior. They're the more fit. Therefore, they're justified to rule over the weaker nations of the world. Why are so many people rich and so many people poor? Again, according to a social Darwinist, they would simply say that the rich people are just superior and that they deserve their wealth, and anybody who's poor is, deserves their status as well. So, again, this served as an ideology to justify both imperialism and social inequalities.